When I was in college, something happened that I'll never forget. I was living in an apartment with some of my friends at the time. We had a 2-bedroom unit, but there were 3 of us who lived there. I was the unlucky one who didn't really get a room. I had a corner of the living room that was blocked off by a large shelf. I did pay less in rent because of that, though. It's an arrangement that a lot of people have to keep costs down. There was a family friend of my parents who lived in the city where I went to college. His name was Adam, and he was kind of like an uncle to me, and we would get together now and then. But this story is about a time when I stayed at his place for a few days. Adam was going away for work, and he asked me to house sit for him. I was happy to do it, because my own living situation wasn't the best. He even offered to pay me for it, but I refused, of course. I went over there on Tuesday morning before school to get the spare key. Adam was a single guy, but he was quite well off, and his house looked like it could belong to a family of 4. It was the corner lot of a nice neighborhood. The grass was neatly cut, and there was a 2-car garage. Not that it would matter to me, because I didn't have a car. After a quick conversation, I took off for school, and while I was there, Adam left for the airport. He did mention that it was okay for me to have people over, but obviously no parties. He just mentioned that I should keep it to a few friends at the most. After I was done at school, I went over to his house, which was a short bus ride away. On the first night, I had a lot of homework to do, so I spent the whole evening buried in the books, without much time to do anything else. It was nice having my own space, and I think I got a lot more done than I normally would at home, or in the library at school. Before I knew it, it was almost midnight. I was surprised that time had gone by so fast, but I was also impressed with myself. I had studied for hours constantly, without getting bored. After that, I decided to call it a night, so I got up and went upstairs to brush my teeth. When I was in the bathroom, I heard a knock on the front door. Just a single knock, not even 2. At first, I thought it was just a creak in the house, but when I looked out the window, there was a man standing there. He didn't look particularly scary or weird, just a normal guy wearing a blue athletic jacket and running shoes. It looked almost like he was out for a late-night jog. I walked down the hall to the top of the stairs and turned on the light switch, but didn't go down yet. When I went back to the window, I saw the man walking away. It was creepy because of the late hour, and I thought he might have been testing out the place to see if anybody was home. I guess it was a good thing that Adam didn't leave the house empty, with people like that around. Even though I was suspicious, there was no way to be sure that he wasn't just at the wrong house, so I didn't call the cops. I just went to bed soon after, and the man didn't come back that night. The next day, I only had online classes, so I didn't have to leave the house. In between classes, I got a lot of my work done, so by the time evening came around, I decided to take a break. I invited my friend Dan over, who was one of my roommates. He got there at about 7 in the evening, and we just hung out talking and watching Simpsons reruns on the large TV in the living room. I told him about the knock on the door the night before, and he thought it might have been somebody scouting out the place for a robbery as well. Same initial thought that I had. With that, I was kind of nervous, and offered Dan to stay over. He said that he'd rather go home though, so I didn't press the issue. By 11:30, Dan took off, and I was alone in the big house again. I stayed up watching TV until just after midnight, and started getting ready for bed. I looked out the front window like the night before, and across the street on the sidewalk, I could see a person walking. It was just a single man, and I thought it looked like the same guy from the night before. I watched for a while, and then he disappeared from my sight. 5 minutes later, I looked out, and I saw him again, walking back in the opposite direction. I was too creeped out to go to bed at that point, so I stayed up watching from the window for a while longer. Sure enough, the man walked right up to the house and started knocking on the front door. He was more persistent this time, and stayed on the porch after knocking for probably a solid minute. He wasn't pounding or anything, but it was still loud enough that I could hear it from upstairs. I watched out that front window for another minute, and then he seemed to walk away across the street. Then I turned away and walked down the stairs, just to check the doors were all locked. To my shock, the front door was actually unlocked. I could hardly believe I was so stupid, but it didn't seem to matter, because the man didn't try to come in. Before locking it, I opened it a little just to look out and make sure the guy was gone. As soon as the door creaked open, I saw someone jump out from the bushes at the side of the house and start running towards me. I got the door closed just in time, and slid the deadbolt into place with less than a second to spare. Any longer and he would have gotten in. The next thing I did was go around to the other doors to double check that they were locked. They were all locked already. All the while, the man was pounding on the door, slamming his body into it. If there was any doubt about his intentions before, they were all gone. This guy wanted in, and he was determined. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the police, then screamed out that the cops were coming. The man must have heard me because he stopped right then. There was an eerie silence because the banging had stopped, but I didn't hear him walk away, and I was standing on the other side of the door. I knew he was still out there. Then he said, "You tell Adam that this isn't over," and I heard him walk away. I caught a glimpse of him from behind as he disappeared down the street. When the police got there, they weren't able to find the guy, and I had to let it go for the night. I was able to get Adam on the phone though, and I told him everything. Specifically, I was concerned about what the man said before he walked off. I wondered if there was some kind of history that he had with the guy, but Adam denied it all. I was still concerned though. How would he even have known his name? It was scary, and I was never comfortable in that place again. Before I hung up the phone, I told Adam that I was thinking about going home because I didn't feel safe there. He was understanding and didn't try to talk me out of it, so I got an Uber to my apartment. That was pretty much the end of it, but I still wonder what the backstory was about the whole thing. If I had to guess, Adam had made an enemy somehow. Whether they were ex-friends, or maybe a guy who he screwed over in a business deal, I'm not sure. It didn't seem random though, and I think I would have been in real danger if I stayed. My parents had left for the weekend when they went on vacation last summer. It was just after I graduated from high school, and I was already working a decent job at an auto shop. Not much money yet, but good experience. Our home sat on a spacious lot in a small town where everyone knew each other, so I thought it was pretty safe. I had lived there since before I could remember, and nothing ever happened before. It wasn't my first time home alone either, so I wasn't expecting anything. I wasn't scared at all. There's one important piece of context that I'll add. The night before, I was on a dating app and I was talking to a girl for a while. At one point, she asked to meet, and I gave her my address, knowing that I would have the house to myself the next day. However, after that, she totally ghosted me. I didn't think much of it, because that kind of thing happens all the time. Now back to the night in question. I was just sitting in the living room with a movie on at around 10 p.m., and then I went to the kitchen for something to eat. As I grabbed a snack, I glanced out the kitchen window towards our backyard. It was getting really dark outside, making it hard to see much of anything. Staring out though, I thought I saw something, but it was hard to tell if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I thought it was a person out there, so I was concerned. Even still, I had decided to settle down in the living room with my snack and some mindless television. However, the worry that I was being watched didn't leave me, and I couldn't just ignore it. About 10 minutes later, I decided to check the backyard, if only to prove to myself that everything was fine. Stepping outside, I ventured across the lawn, my heart thumping in my chest. As I reached the end of our yard, my eyes finally adjusted to the darkness. That's when I saw him, a man standing there motionless, his back to me. He was right up against the tall wooden fence that surrounded our backyard. He stood still like a statue, eerily out of place, but I knew we didn't have any creepy guy statues back there. The sight of him froze me for a moment, then I even took a few more steps closer to be sure of what I was seeing. Then I turned around and started walking back to the house. When I dared to glance over my shoulder, the man was following me. He was moving at a fast pace. I then broke into a full-on run and raced back to the house. I slammed the door shut the moment I crossed the threshold, locking it behind me. My whole body was shaking as I secured every lock on every door. My hands were clumsy because I was freaking out. With the house locked down, I went to the back door, hoping he would be gone, but there he was, standing on our back porch. His face was lit up by the back porch lights, and he was just standing there, watching me through the window. Finally, I got a clear view of the man. He was at least 40 years old with a wool hat and a ripped black sweatshirt. He had a neatly trimmed black goatee, which looked out of place with his otherwise shabby appearance. I ducked out of sight, pressing myself against the wall. After several tense minutes, I mustered the courage to go back out and check, but when I peered out the window again, he was gone. The porch was empty, but I didn't know if he was really gone or just hiding somewhere. I grabbed the phone and called the cops, hoping they would find him. The wait for the police was long because there wasn't a station nearby. It was literally the first time I had ever called them. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the man's face pressed against the glass, but there was nothing. When the police finally arrived, I hurried to the front door, flipping on the porch lights before opening it to greet them. They were two officers, one older with a graying mustache, and a younger one who looked fresh out of the academy. I quickly explained what happened, and once I was done, they went around the outside for a while, but never found anybody. After the police took off, I was really worried that the man would come back and break in, but as far as I know, he was gone for good. I still don't know for sure if it was related to the dating app incident, but I think he might have been catfishing me. If so, then it probably was just a sick joke, because he never did anything to me, even though he could have come back. I stayed off the apps for a while after this, and certainly never gave my address out to a stranger again. That was a dumb mistake, and it took an experience like this to make me realize that. Before we get started with the story, I would like to give some context. I'm from South Africa, and in South Africa, we have this thing called load shedding. This is when the government turns off all electricity in certain parts of towns and major cities. It happens twice daily, usually early in the morning or midday, and then again later in the afternoon or at night. The electricity stays off for a little over 2 hours. It was the middle of December in 2023, roughly a week before Christmas. My family and I were on holiday, and my mother and sister decided to go on a little trip for a week. That left me alone to look after the house and to take care of my dog. I was cool with it, mainly because I'm not really a big fan of traveling. The first half of the week was okay. All I mostly did was play on my PlayStation in the living room, and I took my dog for a walk daily. I always made sure to lock up the house before I left. My mother left me some cash in case I decided to order some takeout, and there was plenty of frozen food in the freezer. Thursday night was when things went for the worst. Like I mentioned earlier about load shedding, the electricity was off for 2 hours, from 10 p.m. until midnight. While the electricity was off, I was chilling in my living room, listening to a horror podcast on YouTube for about an hour during load shedding. I heard some commotion going on in my front yard. At first I thought it might have been my next door neighbor's son coming home. He would come home late from a night drinking with his friends often. Just to clarify, my neighbor has a gate that leads to their backyard, and the gate is adjacent to the front of my house, if that makes any sense. But the next thing I knew, it sounded like somebody was tearing off the big tarp that covered our front gate. When I went out to investigate, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. I could feel my heart beating out of my chest, and my hands were trembling as I was busy unlocking the front door to investigate. I went out to check out the commotion, and to my surprise, someone or a few individuals tore off most of the tarp covering the gate. I decided it was a problem for tomorrow. It was late at night, and there was no electricity, no lights. I had to use my phone's flashlight to assess the damages, and I assumed I scared them off. I was busy unlocking the front door to check out what was happening, and I couldn't be bothered with the tarp at this point. I just assumed they wouldn't come back after I'd unlocked my front door to go and check. And if you're wondering where my dog was, he was chilling in my mom's bedroom, sleeping on her bed, which was located at the back of the house. I decided to pick him up so he could keep me company while I was in the living room. I continued listening to the podcast on YouTube, and about 30 minutes into it, I heard what sounded like somebody proceeding to tear off the tarp. But now my dog heard it too, and he started barking. I nervously opened the front door, ready to confront those who were trespassing on my property. As I opened the door, I screamed "Hey" at the intruders, followed by my dog barking. I would also like to mention that the breed of the dog I own is a border collie. Despite being quite small for his breed and weighing around 15 kilograms, he has a very intimidating bark, similar to that of a German Shepherd, a Rottweiler, or a Doberman. The next thing I knew, I heard the intruders running away after being confronted in the pitch-black dead of night. I went out to my front yard to investigate the further damages, and the intruders tore off most of the remaining tarp, so I decided to tear it off the rest of the way while my dog was standing watch. As I was tearing off the tarp, I noticed that the gate was hanging loosely on its hinges, indicating that they were trying to steal the gate and sell it for scraps. The following day was a Friday, so my mother and sister arrived late from their trip. When I informed them about what happened, I told them that somebody tried to steal our front gate, and that me and the dog scared them off. My mother was concerned for my well-being, but I was not harmed during the whole encounter. The next day, she hired somebody to cover up our front gate with that same tarp that I had removed. I was sent to the shop to purchase a security lock that also comes with an alarm, so if anyone tries to fidget with it, or if someone tries rattling the gate, the alarm will go off. I know this story doesn't seem all that scary, but if you were in that situation where you had to confront somebody vandalizing your property without knowing if they had any form of dangerous weapons, then what else would you do? A creepy thing happened to me several years ago. My house is on the outskirts of a smaller city, and it backs onto a pretty large forest. Large for the area, anyway. I have a family now, but I was living alone at the time. my now wife and I had a long-distance relationship, but that's not too important to the story. All you need to know is that I was alone in a relatively large house in a quiet neighborhood. I had neighbors on each side, and we all had a backyard that backed onto the woods. There was a large wooden fence separating my yard from the neighbors, but on the side with the forest, it was just a short wire fence. I liked that because I could have some privacy from the neighbors, but also enjoy the view of the woods from my back porch. One Friday night, it rained pretty hard. In the morning, I was planning on doing some yard work, and even though the grass was wet, I decided to go out and do it anyway. I was out there cleaning up some piles of leaves when I noticed something odd. There were footprints near the house, imprinted deeply in the softened earth. I was sure they were not mine, because they were way too big, and the tread didn't match my shoes. I paused, rake in hand, staring at them. The only people that should have been around were my neighbors, but it would have been uncharacteristic of them to come into my yard for any reason, or if they needed to, then they would surely ask. I knew them both well enough, and I was sure it wasn't them. I was troubled by what I found, but eventually let it go. I did think there was somebody creeping around my house, though. Later that week, the mystery deepened. When I was out on my back porch, I spotted a single shoe lodged in the mud about 20 or 30 feet from my back door. It looked old, but I was almost sure it wasn't there the last time I was out. Nearby, the ground was marked up with more footprints. I got up to investigate further. I followed the tracks, and some led directly up to my house. This combined with the other incident made me feel really uneasy, but at the time, I still didn't know the extent of it. That night I stayed up late, chipping away at some projects for work, but I still couldn't sleep when I was done. The clock ticked past midnight, and the house was silent. I was still wide awake and sitting in my living room on the couch. I had my laptop out, but I was just reading Wikipedia or something, not listening to anything. A little after midnight, I found myself wandering over to the window, peering out into the darkness that covered my backyard. The outdoor lights cast long shadows across the lawn, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw that there was a man out there. He was walking slowly, almost aimlessly around my backyard. His presence was startling, but in a way, I wasn't surprised, because I knew there was somebody out there before. He didn't seem to notice or care about the light spilling out from the house, just casually made his way around. Calling the police seemed like the only reasonable thing to do, but as quickly as he appeared, the man vanished into the shadows, leaving me to question whether I had seen him at all. The next morning, I scoured the area where I had seen him, looking for any sign that he had been there, but I found nothing new, no new footprints or anything. It was dry out though, so the footprints would not have been as obvious. About a month passed without any further sightings, and the tension began to fade. I didn't know what I had seen, but I was happy enough to let it go. If there was some guy walking around in my yard, then he must have moved on. It was definitely a creepy thought, but he never broke in, not as far as I knew anyway. One cold morning that week, I decided to take my dog Daisy for a walk through the woods behind my house. It was a routine we both enjoyed, and we would do it a few times per week. Daisy ran ahead, eager and full of energy, as I followed at a more leisurely pace, enjoying the forest. After some time, I realized that I couldn't see Daisy anymore. She's usually pretty good at staying close, so I was concerned. I ran up ahead and started calling her name, and I heard her barking. She was way off the path, much further than we had ever gone before. I hurried over and found her standing on the edge of a small clearing. There, hidden among the trees, was an old tent that was surrounded by a considerable amount of trash. It looked like somebody had been living there, albeit in a state of neglect. Among the refuse, I saw old food containers and worn-out clothes. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. It was too much of a coincidence. The footprints, the shoe, the figure in my backyard, and now this. I couldn't shake off the feeling that these events were connected. I wasn't sure what to do, if anything. Eventually, I decided to call the cops, even though it was clearly abandoned. I figured it was best to at least document what was there and have it cleaned up properly. They arrived later that day, inspecting the site. They promised to keep an eye out, but there wasn't much they could do about an empty, forgotten place in the woods. At the very least, I knew what was happening all that time. We definitely had some guy living in the woods out there, and on a few occasions, he came right up to my house. I still don't know if he ever tried to break in, but I don't think anything was stolen. Maybe it's not the scariest thing to ever happen, but I think it was pretty creepy at the time, especially because I don't know what he was capable of. This all happened after the end of a toxic relationship that I had a few years ago. For context, I'm a 31-year-old guy and my ex was 28. We did live together before the split, and we had been living together for about 6 months. I knew we had problems leading up to that, but I thought moving in together would fix it. That was a big mistake. It was just your typical controlling behavior that was the issue. She had to know where I was basically all the time. I literally couldn't go to the store without a barrage of angry texts. Then there would be a huge argument when I got home. I could only take so much of that, so eventually I decided to leave. She was a lot smaller than me, but to be honest, I was actually scared of her. That's why I left suddenly without a face-to-face conversation. I know that seems harsh, but anyone who's been through something similar will understand. When I left, I moved to a smaller town that was about 4 hours away. I had wanted to move out of the city for a while, and my ex was really the only thing keeping me there, since my work was online. I let her have the apartment, which I was still paying for. I didn't bother trying to get out of it, I just wanted to leave. I found a modest house to rent, with the idea of maybe buying something permanent in the area within a year. The town had a quiet charm, and I was keen to start fresh. The house was on a quiet road, and it had a small fenced-in backyard. There were a lot of trees in the area, and the neighbors on each side were about 2 or 3 car widths away. It was a lot more space than I was used to, and it was even cheaper than my apartment in the city. One night at around 11 p.m., I was on my sofa, half watching TV, and playing some games on my laptop. Suddenly, a strange noise from the backyard caught my attention. It sounded like a soft rustling or a faint knock against the back window. I paused my game and muted the TV, then I walked over to the back window and peered out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything through the glare of the windows, so I figured it might help if I turned off the interior light. I flicked the switch and then turned on the outdoor lights. I pressed my face against the glass, scanning the yard. I could see the whole space, but it was definitely empty. I was feeling kind of paranoid, but it could have been nothing. There were some squirrels and birds out there, and it could have been that. Because of that, I went back to what I was doing and turned the TV back on. There were no other noises that caught my attention until a loud bang on the side door. It wasn't like the noise before. This one was sharp and loud. Not like a window breaking, but more like a tree snapping in half. It was like somebody had broken the door down or smashed into it with a sledgehammer. I just sat there frozen for a few long seconds. Eventually, I got up to check because the door was just around the corner. As I approached the side door, I could see that it was wide open and the lock was literally hanging out of place. Part of it was even on the ground. I realized that the sound I must have heard must have been somebody breaking the lock, maybe with a large hammer or a rock, if not some kind of power tool. The door was swinging lightly in the wind, and I was pretty sure that somebody had broken in. They were probably already inside. The only thing I could do was get out of there, but my car keys were in the kitchen. Without them, there was nowhere for me to go. I didn't know any of my neighbors, but in hindsight, I probably could have just gone to them. In any case, I decided to go for my keys, so I walked to the kitchen. As soon as I walked in, I saw her, my ex standing there in the middle of the room. She was looking right at me, and we were separated by about 10 or 12 feet. She was holding one of my large kitchen knives that I kept on the counter, and I think she had the biggest one. The sight was so unexpected, so shocking, that I could barely process it. It was pretty much my worst nightmare to see her there in my place, because I knew she was crazy. Without saying a word, I darted towards the keys, lying just a few feet away from her. It was a risky move, but standing there felt like the worst option. I managed to grab the keys, feeling the cold metal against my skin. The adrenaline pumping through my veins made everything seem both vivid and surreal at the same time. I didn't look back as I bolted for the open side door, the same way she'd come in. I never stopped to check if she was following me. My only focus was on getting to my car. The gravel crunched under my feet as I ran. I unlocked my door, jumped in, and then locked the doors immediately. I drove to a gas station about 10 minutes away, and only then did I allow myself to relax. I then dialed the cops on my phone and explained what happened as best I could. They told me to stay where I was, in the safety of my locked car, and that help was on the way. The police arrived about 10 minutes later and met me at the gas station. 2 officers approached my car. They told me that another headed towards my house. After another few minutes, we headed over to the house together, and the whole time, I was hoping that my ex would be taken out in handcuffs, but that wasn't what we saw. When we got to the house, it was empty. The cops searched it for a while, but she definitely wasn't there. Even though she was gone, I knew it was her, so I told them her info and assumed they would pick her up that night. I later found out that they didn't track her down until the next morning, and by then, she was back in the city. She had made up an alibi, and a friend of hers vouched for it. Because of that, she got away with the whole thing. I thought they should have been able to prove that she was there with fingerprints or something, but I don't think they ever checked that. Come to think of it, I can't even remember if she was wearing gloves, so maybe it wouldn't have helped. After this whole thing was over, I moved out of that house and got a place in a large building with good security. For over a year after this, I was really scared whenever I was alone, but she never tried anything again, as far as I know. It's been a long time now, and I'm pretty sure it's all over.